Hi, Matt Sinclair here, and today I wanted to talk to you about reports, specifically the reports required under the big new regulations for digital markets coming through in the EU and the UK. Now, look, try and contain your excitement, but I promise it'll be fun. And the disclosures required in the big internet regulations that are currently making their way into force might be one of the least appreciated but long-term, most impactful parts in the overall framework. So first I wanted to talk about the kinds of disclosures we're looking at. And I think the first category is disclosures around risks associated with the platform. That's risk assessments in the UK, systemic risk assessments in the EU. Now, the risk assessments in the UK regulation are focused on, you can think about it as kind of the most harmful content or the most unambiguously harmful content in the case of illegal content, and particularly vulnerable users, and children are singled out. In the EU, it's talking about potentially content which, in individual cases, is less harmful, but where it adds up to a risk. They're not using systemic risk in the way it's used in, say, financial regulation. What they mean by systemic risk is really a risk where, because something is happening at large scale or being, the scale of the platform is being exploited in some way, that content can become harmful in a variety of ways, particularly to people's fundamental rights. And I mean, look, these disclosures feel challenging on a number of levels. And particularly, platforms are going to have to balance where they have a more expansive analysis of the risks on the platforms, and that might make those risks seem bigger, or more certain than they really are. But on the flip side, if they leave stuff out, are they going to be accused of a cover-up or not taking some risks seriously? It feels like there's a difficult balancing act there. And these are obviously covering sensitive issues, and you can imagine lots of media and legal interest. For independent researchers, on the other hand, it will be fascinating to see what value they can get out of this data in understanding all kinds of social maladies, social cohesion, for example. If we look across these risk assessments, will it tell us something interesting? For the effort that's probably going to go into these, you'd hope so. The next is compliance reports. This is going to mean that platforms need to not just check they comply with regulations, adjust their behavior at the margin when it doesn't measure up to that new standard. They're going to need a process to comply, check they've complied, and show they've complied on an ongoing basis. And this is going to drive more resourcing needs in compliance functions, which is easier said than done right now when many of these organizations are shrinking, not growing. These are the reports that I think regulators will be watching very closely. They'll drive a major administrative burden. They're probably less relevant for the wider world if the system's working. The next category is justifying your commercial terms. The clearest version here is the requirement to publish what's called FRAND, fair, reasonable and non-discriminatory terms of access for certain digital platforms. There are similar powers to impose FRAND requirements in the UK bill. And there's an explicit expectation here that the Commission will take a view as a regulator on whether it's good enough. So this isn't really just publish fair terms, it's publish fair terms and persuade the regulator that you have done so. The obvious corollary of that for business users and third parties is they might need to upskill themselves to articulate a case on whether or not how they have been treated meets that FRAND standard. For most businesses, most of the time, I'd imagine they'll be content to just keep doing business on the platform. But for those where this is a big deal, where they feel like they aren't getting a fair shake in the platform, it's not uncommon in a regulated sector like this that both sides will be upgrading their analysis, their regulatory affairs, their regulatory engagement. Finally, I think pretty profound transparency, specifically in the ad market. First, I talked about this in an earlier video on trends in the digital ad sector around the commercial terms on which a network does business, really just saying, where's the money going? Crucially, where's the money going in both directions? And I think that's interesting in that if you're a media company, advertisers are going to know more about what you're being paid. But breaking out that whole ad tech stack. Secondly, around what adverts are being placed, who they're being placed by, what they're being pointed at. This is going to be an online searchable repository, which you have to assume for some of these digital networks is going to be absolutely massive, and I think very challenging to assemble. So a lot of transparency around the digital ad networks. I mean, absolute mine around how these things function. I imagine, given how valuable this sector is, it's going to be a cottage industry raking over this data as it comes out, thinking about ways to synthesize it. It's EU focused for now, but people are going to know that in a lot of cases, if something's true in the EU, it's true elsewhere too. These are global ad networks, and while EU member states will have their own quirks, I think unless people are told or shown otherwise, they're going to assume if something's true in the EU, it's true everywhere. So stepping back, why is all this such a big deal? Why am I boring you with talk about regulatory reporting heading into the bank holiday weekend? So first, time and complexity, right? These are going to be big, difficult endeavors to bring some of these reports together. They might often require integrating information from lots of different parts of the organization. They might be relevant to a wide range of internal stakeholders, from comms to legal to products and consumer-facing teams, all of whom might have a view on the output, all of whom might need to manage the consequences. And that is just easier said than done for busy, fast-moving organizations. And given the scale of the potential fines backing these rules up, given how sensitive some of these issues are, the pressure is going to be on to get it right for those working in this sector. And secondly, scrutiny. In many cases, there's an explicit expectation that regulators will look at these reports, compare them across platforms, consider the implications for regulation, and scrutinize whether the reporting is good enough. So it's not just a matter of do this on your own terms. It will be do this and satisfy the regulators and other external stakeholders it's been done right. And that is already happening a bit already. Ofcom looked at reporting under a voluntary political ads code. And even in that much more restricted exercise, well, look, it was by no means a damning report. They did find problems. And the standard's going to be higher. The tolerance for any issues is going to be lower with regulated disclosures. I think the next reason this is a big deal is it could have commercial impacts, particularly when it speaks to interactions with other business users. Companies are going to need to think about how their business users will see this data. Often on both sides of the market, it might be media companies or advertisers or both. I think the digital platforms and their businesses should be looking out for opportunities and threats coming out of this. And I think it's going to require everyone to upskill. Finally, disclosures could lead to further regulatory intervention. I think they're kind of designed to support that. Either new laws addressing issues that they're felt to raise, or I think probably more often, regulators using existing powers or the powers that are being brought in with these new laws. And there's often discretion in these laws for them to be adapted over time. To change in response to changing market norms, a changing sense of harms, and that will be shaped by these reports. So I think from a platform perspective, all of these disclosures are going to need some really serious attention. I think it probably belongs in the box with financial disclosures. Lots of stakeholder impacts, regulators are watching. It's maybe not quite as legally sensitive, but the level of public interest in many cases I think could be much higher than your typical financial results. For policymakers, I think they need to be careful about the impacts of more and more reporting requirements over time. This is an administrative burden, and while the issues are important, you wouldn't want to oppose it lightly when we want these firms out there innovating. You want it as a case for standardization, or just a case for careful scrutiny of the aggregate administrative burden being created. For business users, I think they need to remember they're going to live in a regulated market as well. Even if you're not the business directly subject to the regulation, if you're a media company, an advertiser, a wide range of other companies, you are now operating in a regulated market. And if you're going to look out for your interests, you're going to need to build the functions that come with that, potentially in some cases for the first time. I think for the rest of us, the interesting question will be what, if anything, we can do to synthesize this information, what we can learn about what is a fascinating and important part of the modern world. For the huge effort that's going to go into these, you'd hope that we can come away wiser. I think it's going to be important to resist the temptation to be too gotcha about how we read these things, but to reflect on what we can learn about how the internet works, because this is going to be a huge amount of new information about that part of the world. I hope you found that interesting. Love to hear any thoughts you've got in the comments. Please do like, subscribe, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.